All right, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today. My name is Pam Anglin, and I am with you today as a consultant with Forward Movement Consulting. My good friend Melissa Hewitt Johnson, whose picture was on the screen, founded this firm several years ago. We met at Wake Forest as students the second week of our freshman year at Wake Forest University. So we've known each other for a very, very long time. And we're excited to be doing work in North Carolina, but all over the United States as well. We have our first global client that we're working with right now and just a summer project. So we are thrilled anytime we get the opportunity to come back home. Melissa was actually born and raised in Morganton, North Carolina. So I wanted to make sure and give her a shout out as well, since she is a native North Carolinian and has everybody here in North Carolina in her heart as she's traveling across the globe doing work now. So just wanted to do that quickly and just to share a little bit about who you are. Now a little bit about myself. We can go to the next slide. So this is a lot going on, and this is a slide to tell you what not to do in a presentation and put all of this stuff on one place. But I wanted, hopefully there would be some folks on this call that would recognize some of these logos and some of this work. So I've been very fortunate since I did graduate from college to work all across the community and work with small nonprofits like the Community Care Center, which is a free clinic that covers 3 counties in the Piedmont area. But has a budget of under $1 million because they have doctors and nurses and other medical providers that provide the medical home for about 3,000 patients who otherwise would not receive healthcare, dental care, or medicine if it wasn't for them, all the way up to the second largest nonprofit in North Carolina I was fortunate for working for, and that was Goodwill Industries of Northwest North Carolina, and they covered a third of the state. So I have been fortunate to work for and consult with lots of organizations across North Carolina and a wide spectrum. So when I first left college, I had an education degree and thought I wanted to teach children and wanted to work with children. So I spent some time as a case manager at Big Brothers Big Sisters and a program director there, but then have really branched out into not only healthcare, but access and tackling poverty and thinking about community safety and the environment. And it kind of all feeds in together around our community. But at my core, I feel like a nonprofit organization takes all areas of the organization to work together to be successful and serve the clients we serve. So that's why I have the graphic about marketing and communications, which is the fun part of my job, and getting to think about messaging, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Also spent some time doing some fundraising and development, planning the North Carolina Philanthropy Conference for the state of North Carolina, but also at my core, I am a social worker and started off as a case manager. As I said, I have 2 boys that I am proud to be their mother and to be on this journey with them. And I was born and raised in the mountains of North Carolina, but my happy place is the beach of North Carolina. So that's me in a nutshell, with a lot of things happening on a slide, and we can just jump forward into why we are here today with NC Child. And I am so thrilled to be working with this organization because, like I said, at my core, I'm a social worker. And I care about children and families, and that's how I started my nonprofit career. And of course, you all know that NC Child builds a strong North Carolina by advancing public policies to ensure that all children, regardless of race, ethnicity, or place of birth, have the opportunity to achieve their full potential. And who can't get on board with that? So I'm really thrilled to be here as they have organized, and as Vicki contacted me about doing this learning series, and she with us last month did a session on analyzing and displaying data. And today we're going to be talking about the best practices for communicating about data. But before we do that, I want to jump into the next slide on what today's title could also be. It's about best practices, which is the bottom bullet. But we also, their race plays a part in this, and we want to make sure that when we are displaying data or we're doing messaging with our organization, that we're not perpetuating racism and that we're not causing harm, and that we're not creating messaging that we don't want to send messages about, and that we're being positive and leaving a call to action and being uplifting the clients we serve, the community we work in, and our state as a whole. So that's just some other fun titles that we could have had today, but we're going to land with best practices for communicating about data as we go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about race a little bit. And I always like to, as we're talking about racial equity or centering race or talking about where we are as an organization and the clients we serve, just to put a few things on the table about race and why we're centering race. Sometimes when we do workshops or have conversations or even think about messaging, people are like, why the attention on race? Well, I want to just put some of these things in words. And I know there's a lot of words on the next two slides, but I want it to be said that racial inequities persist in every system across our country without exception. And that is non-negotiable. That is what is there, and it is a statement of fact. Prevailing norms of race muteness or color blindness are a central part of the problem that creates these inequities, and we cannot bring life to or voice these inequities or do something about them until we acknowledge that they exist. And race is very visible. There are other aspects about ourselves, our disabilities we may have that aren't visible, but race is visible, and it's something that we want to acknowledge. Racial and ethnic minorities have been legally prohibited from where they can eat, sit, vote, and speak. And this is unique when it comes around a race. So I want to go on to the next slide with a few more of these centering race statements. In order to achieve racial equity, policies have to be created in order to remove these barriers. Not focusing on race makes it more difficult to understand the impact of race. And when you look at other dimensions of identity, income, gender, sexuality, education, ability, age, citizenship, and geography, there are inequities based on race in all of these. So if anyone wants to have these statements, I am more than happy to share them. And of course, this is being recorded because I feel like these statements are good to just center race as we talk about racial equity. Organizations cannot afford not to do this work or not to think about it. So going on to the next slide for today. As I mentioned, Vicki led a session with us last month on analyzing and displaying data. And I want to go through a quick review of that. And the first is kind of, I want you to open up your chat. I'm going to have to do the same thing so that I can participate with you. Is that on the next slide, I have summarized what we heard back during that session of how does your agency use data? If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, it's got a list of how those of you all that participated in the call and those that did last time said they use data on a lot of reports. That was mentioned a lot, mostly internal, some board, some quarterly and yearly, and I'm assuming that had something to do with some grant reports or applications, communicating impact. And what was surprising to me is that the lowest amount of responses was around sharing data with your stakeholders or your donors. So does this resonate with all of you on the call today? And again, some of you all were probably with us last month, but you just use the chat if there's another way that your agency used data, or just do a +1 if this is right along with the ways that you use data. It'll take about 30 seconds to hear from you all on that. Yes. For planning purposes, thank you. That's an additional one that we did not include in the summary. Everyone else. Reporting to boards and planning. Awesome. Surveillance, productivity of staff. Good comments. Evaluation of public health. Stakeholder with media. Media was one that we didn't really put in the summary from last time. I'm not sure if anyone mentioned that last time. Awesome. Thank you for that confirmation. We'll go on to the next slide and start talking about a review of what Vicki covered in the first one. And I want to do this because a lot of what you'll hear from me today on messaging will tie directly into these 3 tips that she went through in setting that foundation. So I'm actually going to go over some of the content she shared. First, that data needs to be presented in ways that make it clear for people to see what's wrong, but also what they can do about it. It's just the foundation. So I thought that was really impactful and a great way to set that aside and say the first step is presenting an accurate picture of what's happening. And we can't do that without showing whatever data is available, and not only with what's happening, but encouraged us to dig deeper and think about why it's happening. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and the why, because that is so important. And then the second tip of consider how outcomes may be linked is turning information into action with data, and consider the different ways that can be linked. One can lead you to consider another, to explore, and even we'll go talk a little bit about root causes. So when we think about how poverty might tie to education, how education might tie to employment, how employment might tie to wages, how gender ties to wages, and even how employment might tie to self-sufficiency, and how we might all want to see outcomes move in all of those areas. Tip 3, and don't let the data stand alone. I mean, I think that we all hear all the time that people are a heart and a mind, and some people just love data. I like every now and then digging down deep into the data and nerding out on it a little bit and seeing what's there. But we also know that it should not stand alone, that doesn't do it for everybody. You're not going to accurately represent your organization, your programs, your services. You're not going to be able to get the support from grants, from individual donors, or from other key community stakeholders if you only use data. You've got to use it as a driving change when speaking to both the head and the heart. And that without context, you're leaving it up for interpretation. You might create issues or create messaging or scenarios that you never intended to get across if you let it stand alone. And it's the people behind the data that's memorable. It's the stories, and it's being able to make that connection. Even if it's just one story about a little boy named Tim, that's an example. You may serve thousands or tens of thousands of children, but if you get people connecting with Tim, they're smart enough to realize that Tim is just one of many, and that if you've changed Tim's life in some way, then you have the ability to be able to impact so many others. So go on to the next slide of review that we are talking about. This was some takeaways that we did as a survey at the end in the chat of the last session in May. And I was really kind of combining it all in of people saying that they took away from it that we need to reinforce data with context, the story that I was just talking about, the people, little Tim behind the story and all those numbers that you're sharing, and laying out a course of action, using data as a way to lead to something positive and to create the change that we want to see. When we were centering race, and on that slide, it talked about that we can't do this without making some kind of change, and and change can't happen without a course of action. And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about the head and the heart, and what that means with combining the why and the what, and combining data with story. So all those things take away from that. So are we ready? Let's jump right into the content for today. And the first thing I want to talk about under best practices for communicating data is knowing your audience. And so as I go through each of these examples and the meat of what we're talking about around best practices, is I'm going to try to use some examples of either work I've done in the past, organizations I've directly worked with, or the ones that I've consulted with. And I don't know if there's going to be anyone on this call that currently works for any of these organizations now. I don't have that information, but feel free to send me a chat or let me know if you need to correct something I'm saying or an example I'm using. So the first thing is know your audience and consider who's receiving your message. The example I have for this is from the time that I was working with Goodwill of Northwest North Carolina. And as I said, it is the second largest nonprofit in North Carolina and covers 31 counties of North Carolina. And I was very fortunate when I was there to have an entire marketing team with graphic artists. And we always tried to consider the messaging and the look of our messaging and the story that it told, and wanted to have a very diverse group of images and diagrams and variety with all of that. But the graphic artist put together this wonderful spread of people working in a community, and they were very diverse in age and ethnic background and race. But then I realized that the content that this flyer was going to Wilkes County. And Wilkes County is not a very diverse place. And we thought that, and so I was sent back and I said, you know, this is a time when it's okay if you don't have a very diverse group of people on your marketing materials, because the audience that's receiving it needs to identify. They need to show up and they need to see the call to action. They need to see people that look like them. They need to see professions that look like them. And actually, one of the images on another flyer one time was an image of someone doing a particular type of work that wasn't even offered in that county. I was like, there are no jobs doing this type of work in this county, so we probably shouldn't show somebody doing this work if it doesn't apply to the people in that community. So just know your audience. And it's kind of like the who, what, when, where. So break apart the who. And then once you get within the who, think about the age group that's going to be receiving this message. Does it matter that they want to see people that look like them? The actions that people are taking, do they need to think about what they're doing? Can they see themselves doing that? Because your call to action is not going to be effective if people don't see themselves in the messaging, or if it's not relatable to them. So that takes me to the next slide, which is about knowing your community. It goes hand in hand. It's a little bit different because your pieces or your marketing or your messaging may be going to a stakeholder or a corporate group. But if you're talking about marketing your organization as a whole, say through a website or through a billboard or something that a broad community is going to be seeing. So the first one kind of might have been focused on it may be a targeted audience that you're looking for with that. This bullet is about knowing the community for your general messaging. And it's always important to, when you're talking about your data and you're releasing your data, is to know how that layers with your local census data. So if you're putting out a study that says 30% of a certain demographic is this, but that's the exact percentage of what the community makeup is, then there may not be a call to action. There may not be a problem. There may not be an issue. There may not be an area for you to work on if it aligns directly with the local census data. Now, if we layered it with the state and the state looks a little different than your county or your service area, you should probably know that as well, and just not let the data stand alone, as Vicki said last time, but know how it layers with others. Particularly if you are looking at communities and wanting to take an asset-based approach to communities, and you're trying to think about the strengths of the community. I have lived and worked in Winston-Salem for a long time, and the community is known historically for tobacco and textiles. So what are some of the strengths within the community and the jobs? So now it's about technology and about innovation and about arts. So what is your community, and how is your community trying to define itself? If you're in a rural area, in Asheville, they really wanted to emphasize the arts community and valuing education or being inclusive. So whatever your community assets are as a whole that other entities are trying to promote, layer that with your messaging and make it align, because it only makes it stronger and resonates more with people. So I'm going to jump on to the picture you paint and how your things look. And this is where we're going to, after we get through a couple of slides, and we'll give you some other examples and do some interaction with you through chat. So stick with me just a little bit longer as I'm talking about the messaging and going a little bit deeper into the picture you're painting with your message. We've all probably heard the saying that a picture paints 1,000 words or speaks 1,000 words. So we don't want to forget that that is happening with your visuals as well. So when you think about your look, talking about the visuals you're using, the images, the types of graphics, this is the first thing that's probably going to draw somebody in. Think about the lady in the background of this slide. We've noticed the colors and what she's wearing, but also she's teaching. So we're thinking about, she could be a great example of how she's representing the words on this slide, in that looks like she's teaching someone and trying to display and get a message across to someone. So we also have to know that we can't just choose anything and throw it up there. Some people, they want to use a lot of free clip art and images and Google things. Just make a note on the side. If you've not done this before, and as you're Googling, I do this all the time with marketing, is I Google a phrase or something I'm looking for, whether it's schoolhouse or child painting or whatever it may be. There's lots of free things out there that's not stock photos that you have to pay for. You can get lots of free graphics just by simply Googling. But sometimes just for fun and to drive home this point, try Googling the word nurse and see what pops up. And then to juxtapose that, Google the word boss and see what comes up. And I won't spoil it for you, but it's very disappointing. I will say that when you Google, you can probably imagine. Also, when you're thinking about labeling and color choice, that kind of goes hand in hand, and thinking about the order of things. And I'm going to give you an example of this a little while later. But think about who gets listed first. Are you always listing your males first? And why? Have you considered, when you're listing demographics around race and ethnicity, what are you listing first? If you're listing the highest number, then sometimes you might end up always having a white and Caucasian at the top or at the beginning. So think about the ordering and how you do that. Consider sorting things alphabetically and see how that changes. Think about a color choice. And I'm going to show you a really bad example of color choice that an organization used. But also you have programs, and whether it's Word or in your Microsoft Office, that will take a family color and of greens or purples or whatever it may be. Of course, I know that many of us are tied to our branding guidelines when we do this, but consider using color choices that aren't tied to a particular race. Staying away from black or white or red or whatever it may be, or yellow, but using colors and the families of colors that you can choose to use, so that you're not making connections that you don't intend to make or that aren't already there. And again, I'll show you a bad example of that. But also understanding that when you're labeling things, we're sometimes tied to the systems and the examples that we have to use. So if you work for a school system, there's lots of acronyms, whether it's EDS or LEP or things like that, that we're tied to certain labels and we have to use that language in our messaging. So I recognize that, but also think about things that are in your control, and how you can be a little bit more inclusive and creative when doing that. So we're going to jump to the next slide, which is about the story, which is the fun part. Oh, here's the example of the bad one. This was colors that was chosen by an organization to demonstrate a data point, and an example of what not to do. Then we have an example of another organization here in North Carolina on the next slide. Thankfully, that was a little bit better, some of the colors they chose. And so here's an example of choosing to do it in alphabetical order and how it's represented. And then the next one is another kind of example of how they chose to do it with colors, and again, in alphabetical order. And an example of EDS is a language that the system uses and has to be used. And so you can also see this was an example of a key or a legend of how to do it. So all the lines are kind of equal. They all end at the same place to not only make some equality there, but in alphabetical order, there was some order and some intentional thought and color. So this kind of example of all of it, like the color they use, and listing it in alphabetical order, and then even choices. So yeah, we'll go on to the next slide about the story and why it's important to connect the heart and the mind and create a narrative. So when I think about root causes, when you're talking about stories, and also how you're going to communicate that. Last time, Vicki had a great quote that I'm going to read to you all that I thought that really resonates when you think about the storytelling, is that numerical representations of human lives do not necessarily convey the importance of those lives. All too often, the numbers represent dry statistics, the human beings with the tears dried off. So we've got to be able to bring to life, so to speak, the data and the story behind the data. And this is what's important. People are going to want that data. People pay for that data. And there's researchers who and funders who want that and are expecting that. And the data is very important for us to know where we're at and to chart a path of where we're going. But understanding that the people behind it is the heartbeat, literally beating behind that. So think about the titles that you're using, the captions under photos, using actual names, not just saying, the researchers sometimes want to take names and put numbers behind it. If any time that you can actually show real pictures is a plus, but anytime you can put a real name behind it is even better. And even you may have to create a composite story. So the story you tell may be a blend of 2 or 3 demographics or children that you've worked with or families, but being able to create a composite story that speaks to the truth of your impact is important. So know and thinking about the titles and the things that you're using, whether it's a people first language. An example of that would be saying people with disabilities versus disabled people, and speaking to it as a descriptive instead of labeling a group. And also we have to acknowledge that as some of our organizations have been around for a long time, there's lots of articles about this out there and lots of things that you can read about storytelling and creating a story and people first language. But language is constantly evolving, and the titles we use, the AP style, and what word choice is preferred is constantly changing. And so it's on us to evolve with that and to grow and educate ourselves as we go along about what is necessary or what those changes may be in order to get our message across. And we'll go on to the next slide, where we're going to talk a little bit about the look and the message together. And that is not creating negative connections for people, either through the labeling, the titling, and the picture, and not equating race to a problem. Those are very important things to think about, and the connections that you bring together. So this is where we're going to go through a little example together. So pull your chat back out. I hope this goes well. I did it in person for a staff team around communications and fundraising not that long ago. So I'm hoping that it translates well on Zoom as well. And it hopefully will drive home for you the connection between how our look and the messaging that we're doing can create images or ideas for people that we may not even think are there. So we'll go to the next slide. This is a piggy bank. It's a very basic clip art that we've used. So this was used to represent a data set. So use your chat. What do you think when you think of a piggy bank? What comes to mind? And if you want to take that a step further, tell me what data point this might have been used to represent with a nonprofit organization. Saving money, savings, very good. Savings or investment, saving and donations, $ donation, personal savings, family, economic safety net. A lot of saving money, putting money in that bank, financial funding. Yes, those are all good ones. And what I was hoping you would say, because this is an example of where I think that the organization missed the mark with their clip art and connecting it with the data set. So the next slide actually has a portion of the data point they had with it. You might be kind of surprised. They used a piggy bank, which just about every single one of y'all connected to personal savings, investing money, money coming in, to represent revenue lost. So if they were communicating to their donors, right, if they were communicating to their donors, this recently happened in just the past year. This was a COVID related stat that they lost revenue over the past year. I love that example. So the recommendation I made to the organization, like Sarah said, should be a broken one. A simple fix. You don't have to make it that bad. All they had to do is kind of flip the pig upside down and have the money coming out. So it just was a miss, because if we took what people look at, if you're one of those people that you scan a page and you look to an image first, then you're going to think, oh, money going into piggy bank, this is good. Data point, not good. So this was a miss here. So we're going to the next one. Now hiring. What kind of images or thoughts does this bring to mind for you? Go ahead and put it in the chat. And if you're bold, you can go ahead and speak to what you think the data point might have been about. Jobs, staff turnover, interesting. Short-staffed, how many new jobs created, looking for new employees, unemployment rate, needing new employees, employment rates, interviews. Yeah, so this one is it is a little bit more of a mixed bag, and could be, some of you all had some negative in there, some had some positive, whereas the piggy bank with the money coming in across the board speaks positive. Now hiring, a couple of you did put in some things that could be negative and positive. So a typical thing, just like many of you said, that this would be, we need new employees. We're all in that mindset nowadays. I think the past, if this had been used pre-COVID and everything that we're seeing with the job turnover and restaurants having a employee shortage and service, if we didn't know all these things about employment rates and what's happening currently, we might view this a little differently. We might see it as more of a positive of opportunity, and not only needing new employees, but what are some, you could see it as not only opportunity, but an advancement or going to the next level. So I'm going to share the data point with this one, because I felt like this was not a great clip art to use, but just not as bad as the other one. So here's the data point that it went with.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
This is the opposite.
Yeah. It's not a good thing. It's not about opportunity. There's a lot that's happened over the past year. And this was actually a data that was in a news segment about women leaving the workforce, which is sad. And as Samantha says, kind of tone deaf. It's really unfortunate because it just wasn't the message that we wanted to get across with this organization. And you got to think about, why folks left, and even the word choice, as I think Vaughn just pointed out, she's reading my mind there, that these weren't women that were all the time leaving by choice. These could have been doctors, highly educated, productive leadership team, VPs of companies that were leaving their roles just to take care of children, to be at home with children as they were going through virtual school. So this was not necessarily an opportunity, which I think the now hiring sign speaks to. So I hope this is a couple of good examples to make you think about just the simplest things of just the clip art that you're using and how it comes across. So we go to something a little more positive, like the music we started with, which was a great intro. So I want to, if nothing else, encourage you to think about affirmations as you're creating your messaging, to think about the framing, how it's positive. You probably have core values as an organization. Think about those. If you don't have, a lot of people have their mission statement front and center. They've got their vision statement front and center. But I think what really speaks to the heart and the work of an organization is oftentimes the values. So if you don't have your organization's values printed and in front of you as you're working, do that. And so, word choice definitely plays into this, and wanting to have relatable statements that speak about impact and importance. And one project that I was involved with when I was working with Habitat was some global initiatives and local. So as we know, Habitat is one of the top brands recognized nationally. They're pretty young when it comes to their work in the United States, but globally, they are one of the top recognizable brands because of what they have done across the globe. And it was about they started this campaign a couple of years ago where they wanted to use every statement. And I think this is something that every organization can learn from. And I'm typically one of those language folks that I cringe when people say things like always and never, because I'm like, that's never is never true, because there's always an exception. But I think that when we're thinking about presenting our data, we want as many people as possible. It's probably not realistic to think that everyone, but we want as many people as possible to connect with what we're doing and what we're saying. So when Habitat says globally that everyone deserves a decent place to live, it's simple. And when you have a little child sitting there, it's hard not to imagine not wanting a child to have a safe, secure roof over their head, where they can do their schoolwork, where they can feel safe, and not want that for every single child. So thinking about relatable statements that can simply and directly make that impact for you. And some other examples of positive framing or affirmative thing is like when we're talking about access, instead of saying, things like left behind or the lowest. I think this came up on our last webinar, is saying things like they're the furthest from opportunity, and watch that negative statements of being disadvantaged or being vulnerable. There are some organizations, and again, you may be tied to your brand guidelines, but anytime that you can, think about what is something that will connect with everybody and how you can take your organization values, which I hope align with your personal values, and choose that over a message that's going to create bias every single time. The next slide also has an example from Habitat that's a little bit more about just home. There, it makes it personal, and it's language that says, I'm working to ensure that no family has to pay anywhere near half their paycheck for housing. And the next data slide that came with this was that in this particular community, 48% of families were paying almost half of their income just to pay for their housing, and that made them cost burdened. In North Carolina, we say anything over 30%, and we think that 1 in 3 families in North Carolina are cost burdened when it comes to their home. But at the beginning of that, the positive framing is that we want to make sure that no family has to pay half. And then you can follow that up with a data point of what it is for your community. But if you think about what is a message that everybody can agree on, and then start there and start from a positive place of framing and start from the values of the organization, to not speak or create bias in there. The last thing I'm going to encourage you as you're creating and you're thinking about ways to display your data on the next slide is very simple. It's a shareable world. It is very easy now to find examples and find samples. We're in North Carolina and we work with children, but there's global initiatives working with children. There's national organizations. A lot of our local nonprofits in North Carolina, we don't have a lot of money. We don't have marketing teams. I've worked at a large organization that had marketing teams and had 2 graphic designers on staff. Most organizations don't have that. You're trying to create these things the best you can and as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. So get out there and find other organizations, whether they're national, global, even local. You've got a great resource with NC Child that's got data points and data cards for your specific area available to you. Get out there and find someone that you like their messaging and just start following them. I do screenshots all the time of things and examples that I want to show people. It's where I pulled some of these examples from, was just literally a screenshot or taking it, a picture of something that was sent my way to share this. So find and follow those, and take advantage of those organizations that do have money for marketing, or have marketing teams, or excellent graphic designers on staff. Take advantage of that. It's easier to not recreate the wheel. Also wanting to send you just some thoughts on some resources on the next slide. There is a great tool at thesamystreet.com. She has 4 or 5 different one-pagers that you can download about how to talk about race, about how to do your messaging. And as I mentioned earlier, in addition to just the data points that NC Child has available for you, is think about county and census data and knowing your community, and know that that's available. And it's, if you're a nerd, if you nerd out on some data and knowing your community, that census stuff can be, you can get lost in it, but just know that it's there. So I want to close with a quote, and then I'm going to unshare the screen and Wafania's, and we are going to have some time for Q&A the last 10 to 15 minutes. And this is a quote that I like, and an image that I have on my wall here at the office. It says, "Diversity is a fact." And aren't we so thankful for that? Equity is a choice. Inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. So what are we going to do with our data, with our messaging, with how we make it look, that's going to be intentional, it's going to be thoughtful, because that's the action we have to take. And as a community, it goes back to that old quote, the old quote of rising waters raises all ships, that it doesn't matter who ends up benefiting in the long run, that we all have to get there together. And that is the goal for the community. And we want everyone to belong in the community that we create. And we can do that in our, even if it's just a Facebook post, we could do it in our messaging, and we can do it in how we look, and even down to the little clip arts we choose with a piggy bank. That one more search could have easily found a broken piggy bank, or we could have flipped it upside down to send the message that we wanted to send. So I want to just take some time now to close. We've got 12 minutes to at the end of the hour, and see if anyone has some questions. And thank you, Vicki is dropping some more other racial equity and framework examples in there for resources. Feel free to pop a question or anything that you might want to ask in your slide.
Pamela, I have a question for you, if it's okay to jump in this way.
Absolutely.
One question I always have is like, how do you test your messages or images, or if you're making a share graphic or something like that, do you have a team or other folks that you have look at images? Because sometimes I don't necessarily see something in an image that somebody else does see, particularly somebody who comes from a different racial or ethnic background than I do, somebody with a different religious background than I have. So I'm just curious about kind of what your recommendations are for, you know, road testing something before you put it out there broadly.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I hate to say this, but I've used my children a lot, particularly around if it's a package or a post or something like that. Like I try not to rush when creating things. And I always like to print. I always like to get a hard copy of something, sit with it and look at it. Even if it's something that's going to go on social media or the web page, if I'm designing a web page or looking at workshopping a web page, I still end up printing it on paper and sitting with it and looking at it, because once it's out there, it's out there. And I have, over the years, I've got, like I said, there's 2 boys at home. I have taken the printed documents home and I've laid it out. And they know now that I'm looking for reactions. And sometimes as simple as, "Mom, that color is awful. That's too many words." I get that one a lot, too many words. But I think that if you have that trusted team, and again, we work for small nonprofits, don't hold your messaging and your information so tight. And and 'cause sometimes we're like, when we're creating something, even if it's like an appeal letter or a report, like we don't want to share it because I mean, but what hurt if somebody likes your idea and does something similar with their organization, like it's not a bad thing because again, we're all in the same community doing this together. So I think that as nonprofits and being working in nonprofits for a long time, I would just encourage you not to hold so tight to things and ask for feedback. And when it comes to you kind of had a layered question there, Fawn, with especially images that may create reactions around race or ethnicity or economic level. You can sometimes Google some of that and just put the images in there and like say, but don't find the one person that represents the demographic that you work with and always go to them to ask. Like you've got to have relationship to do that. So I just want to name that, like, we don't want to keep going and asking for feedback from the one person that we want them to speak for an entire group. Nobody wants to do that. So just let's try not to do that, but do our own research. And anytime you have an opportunity to sit and talk about these things, I have an association group that I meet with regularly of peers in my area. And like I said, I will oftentimes take those printed images of them and be like, so what do you think about this? Or how does this sit? Or how does this come across? And get people's reactions that way. I think that's always travel. I mean, when we're now getting back out and getting close to people in person now. So I would always travel with my latest designs or graphics or messaging to get people's reactions to it just out in the general public, because it's going to really, if I hold too tight to it and I roll something out, then I'd rather have it from few people closer to me than from the general public. So it's definitely, and creative people, if some people take feedback better than others. But just be honest. I mean, I think that if someone comes to you with questions, be honest with how it reacts. I mean, just like, even if it's simple as a clip art of a piggy bank, just say like, what does this make you think of? You don't have to tell them how you think you're going to use it or what you may do with it, but throw it out there and just get some reactions. You'd rather have it on the front end. I think Alicia's saying basically the same thing. You want that feedback early in the creative process.
Pamela, how can we build will among our colleagues to center racial equity in our work and our public-facing work?
That's a great question. And one that I want us to keep asking each other. I want us to keep having the dialogue. Racial equity is a journey, and you may have different labels. We've all seen probably the image of the kids at the baseball game about what diversity means, what inclusion means, what equity means, what belonging means. And there's so many other, what justice means. There's so many other words being added to this. So whatever work your organization has started, and if you haven't, I encourage you to, because it's too important not to do the work, is never feeling afraid to name the race piece of it. And that's why I put those statements at the beginning, because I think so many people are just afraid to just say the race statements and say that racial inequities persist in every system in our country. We call it diversity, inclusion, and access work. For some organizations like museums or science centers, access is a big deal. For some, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the DEI work. So whatever your language and your acronym may be, just do it and don't stop. There's not a start and an end date. It is a continual journey. It's a continual journey with you as an individual. It's a continual journey with your organization, with the community you're in. And a lot of times the individuals are at a different place than the organization. The organization is at a different place than even the communities they serve. And that's okay. And that the main thing is accepting that everybody is on the journey, and not making anyone feel bad for where they're at on their path, because it is a path. It's an individual path, it's an organization path, and it's a community path. And some are going to have more roadblocks than others. But my thing is just keep talking about it, and don't ever think that you're done or that you've gotten somewhere. Because it's something that we're going to continually to work on. There's not an end date for this. But thankfully, hopefully a lot of us as individuals and organizations, we've started on it. So the last thing for everybody, we've got 4 more minutes. What was your key takeaways from today? Just fill the chat up with those. What will you do differently? What really resonated with you? What would you say was a takeaway from today? Awesome messaging. I like all the thoughts about being positive, the positive framing. Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Positive framing. You are all doing such incredible and important work for children and families. And our state gets a lot of attention about the work we're doing sometimes, the diversity. I saw an article just the other day that we were actually leading the country in making sure that the COVID vaccines had an equitable distribution. So I thought, yay, North Carolina, that felt good. So just know that no matter what you're doing and where you're at, you're doing great work, and hopefully something today can really help layer that and give you the oomph, to dig one place deeper and to go to the next level. Vicki, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today for part 2 of the Dismantling Racism with Data series. And like we mentioned earlier, we're going to be sending out the recording afterwards. So look out for that in your inbox. And thank you all so much for being a part of this project. All right. Hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Bye, everyone.